All right, we started last week with our New Testament overview series, a New Testament story series with the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to move forward this week to the Gospel of, no, we started with Matthew. We're going to move forward to the Gospel of Mark this week, which is the shortest gospel of all four of the Gospels, and including, of course, the Synoptic Gospels, and is probably the oldest of the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark was probably written in Rome with Gentile readers in mind. The date is disagreed upon. Probably the earliest dates would be in the early 40s, and the latest dates would be in the 60s. It's somewhere in between there, before the destruction of Rome, certainly, and probably in the early 40s or even perhaps the 50s. Mark is someone who has spent a lot of time with Paul, went on his missionary journeys with him, apparently, according to Paul's own writings, and also was apparently really close with Peter, who seems to have been the primary source of his writing, the Gospel of Mark. That is attested to by one of the church fathers in the 2nd century named Papias, who talks about how Mark collected all the eyewitness accounts from Peter and shaped them into the book that has now become known as the Gospel of Mark. He's referred to by a couple of names throughout the New Testament, by Mark simply, and then also by John Mark even more commonly. And you can look at 1 Peter 5, verse 13. Peter says that Mark is with him and is spending time with him, and that Mark sends them greetings. Colossians 4, verse 10, Paul sends Mark to the church at Colossae and urges the Colossians to welcome him and speaks very highly of him. In Acts 13, verse 5, John Mark is assisting Paul and Barnabas in proclaiming the gospel and preaching the gospel. He's playing some role in assisting them, probably proclaiming alongside them. And then in 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, Paul even describes John Mark as someone who's very useful to him in ministry. So he wasn't as big of a name as Paul and Barnabas even and Peter, but he was significant in the early church movement, played a big role with Paul and Peter, and was very close to them, apparently especially to Peter, and collects a bunch of his eyewitness testimonies into the gospel that we now know as Mark. And it's considered the earliest gospel for a lot of reasons, but the fact that it's the shortest gospel is one of them. It is the shortest gospel by a good margin. And it's likely that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel as sort of early source material, as eyewitness accounts, as a reliable resource for their gospels. And so a lot of the information in Mark is included in Matthew and Luke as well. And then Matthew and Luke have their own particular things as well. Mark has been called, I think rightly so, in a lot of ways, quote, a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Mark is very focused on the passion narrative, on Christ getting to Calvary and getting to the cross, and he's moving us very quickly there. He's been described as racing us to the cross, that Mark is really in the beginning sections of his book, in the beginning chapters, doing everything he can to get us to the cross quickly, and we'll see that. He has, more than the other gospel writers, he has emphasis on miracles, and especially exorcisms, and that probably stands out in Mark's gospel just because Mark is so focused on the actions that Jesus is doing. He's less focused on the things Jesus says as the other gospels, especially the synoptics, and John as well. And he's more focused on what Jesus did. And he's, again, moving us forward, action to action to action, very quickly, racing us towards Calvary. And just like the other gospels, his primary concern is that he wanted to give an eyewitness account for the early events of Christianity, to testify to the truth of Christianity and the truth of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. We're giving proclivities, or the big repeated themes in each of these Gospels. We did that with Matthew last week. We'll do it again today. And again, the primary theme that we see in Mark is his being action-oriented, is his focusing on the works that are done by Christ and moving us very quickly. In fact, even using the word immediately, at least our English word immediately, several times throughout his Gospel as he's moving us forward to the next place. You see it in all of these verses that are on your screen. Over 20 times he uses this word immediately to move us forward to the next section. He uses it, in fact, 8-9 times in just chapter 1. So immediately Jesus did this, immediately they moved on to this, immediately they moved on to this, moving us very quickly and forwardly through his gospel towards the cross, towards Calvary. Very fast pace in that way. His second big proclivity is his Christology. He has a very significant Christology. That is, he talks about Christ in a very specific sort of way. He doesn't want his readers to see Christ primarily as a triumphalistic Messiah, like the one they expected. Right? The early Jews expected the Messiah to be triumphalistic, that is, to come out of heaven in a chariot, if you will, and show himself to be the king in a very obvious way. But Mark wants to make sure that these first century Jews realize that Christ did not ever intend to be seen in that way, and that he wanted to be seen as the suffering Messiah, and that those two characters of the Old Testament that are often divided in Judaism, of the suffering one, the suffering servant and the triumphant king is actually one and the same person. Like we did last week, we see that the Jewish method of inclusio also in Mark's gospel with the phrase the Son of God. He starts in chapter 1, verse 1, and says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he ends the book at the very end of chapter 15 with that same phrase, Son of God, in a way that seems to be that Gentile means of inclusio, where in chapter 15, verse 39, it says, when the centurion stood facing him, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. And so he starts by identifying Christ as the Son of God, and then at the end of the book, this man who sees Christ die affirms that surely this man was indeed the Son of God. So you have this beginning and conclusion by Mark with this idea of the Son of God, saying that Jesus is the Son of God in the beginning, and then finishing with the affirmation coming from another's lips that he was indeed surely this Son of God. A section that's also significant where it's talking about Jesus telling them that he's going to die and rise from the dead, and then them not understanding, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But Mark does that more than anybody. Mark shows us that Jesus is telling them what's going to happen about his death, burial, and resurrection. Right? He is the suffering Messiah. He's not the one that expected to win Israel in physical kingdom. He expected from the beginning to go to the cross, and Mark wants to make that clear to them, and does that more than even the other writers of the Gospels. Thirdly, he has a proclivity of focusing on discipleship. That is, what it means to follow Christ. What does it mean to follow Christ? And that goes along with that Christology hand in hand, that what it means to follow Christ is not to follow him to a throne here and now, though maybe that's the case ultimately, but what it means to follow Christ is to follow the suffering Messiah, not the triumphalistic one. And then fourthly, and especially peculiar to Mark, is this what's been referred to as the secrecy motif, where Mark emphasizes more than any other gospel writer that Christ continually warns people not to tell anybody who he is. Right? We see that a lot through Mark's gospel, which is very interesting. I want to just give you the outline here of the gospel like we finished last time with Matthew. I'll put it on your screen for you, the outline of this gospel, how it lays out. And I'll give you a kind of general outline and then tell you what fits underneath each one of those. The first section, verses 1 through 15, are just the prologue, right? His sort of preliminaries to ministry, which covers John the Baptist and his baptism, his temptation in the wilderness, and those things. And then from chapter 1 through most of chapter 8, or at least half of chapter 8, we have his ministry in Galilee, right there where he grew up in a lot of ways. His ministry in Galilee, where he begins proclaiming the kingdom is at hand. He begins teaching in synagogues and performing miracles, especially exorcisms and healings. Great crowds start being attracted by him, and he starts having his disputes with the religious leaders. The next big section is D.A. Carson calls it the way of glory and suffering, which climaxes with that recognition by Peter of Christ's messiahship, where he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, etc. And John, of course, making that clear that he was indeed the Son of God through Peter's words. And here in this section, very interestingly, from chapter 8:27 through 10:52, we have this trio of statements or events repeated 3 times. First, Jesus predicts his death. He does that in 8:31, for instance. And then the disciples misunderstand what he said, right? They don't get what he's saying in the next verses, 32 and 33. And then Jesus teaches about the cost of discipleship in the verses that follow. He does that in chapter 8, he does it in chapter 9, and he does it in chapter 10, the same little trio of events, him predicting his death, the disciples misunderstanding what Jesus is saying, and then lastly, teaching about the cost of discipleship. Again, this motif of this suffering Christology, this idea of Christ as the suffering Messiah, and him saying to the apostles, and by extension to us, that in order to follow Christ, it's going to look like that. We also have in this section his talk of divorce and the transfiguration and those things. Chapters 11 through 13, to the end of 13, is his final ministry into Jerusalem as he enters Jerusalem on the colt, cleanses the temple, is dealing with the religious leaders, and we see what's about to happen. And then the final chapters, 14 through 16, are the climax that Mark has been working to get to the entire time of the passion story and the empty tomb and the resurrection, where we have the Passover and then his arrest and then his trial, his crucifixion, and then finally his resurrection. And so these big themes that we see in Mark of the action-oriented nature of Christology, discipleship, and even to secrecy motif are all aimed at that theme of wanting us to see who Christ is, what it means that he's the Son of God, not in some triumphalistic way, but as the suffering Messiah, and that what it means to follow him is to follow that sort of Christ, that sort of Son of God. The shortest of all Gospels, likely meaning it's the first of all Gospels, are being part of that role, and a gospel written primarily by the eyewitness account of Peter. So there's a lot of ways in which it's Peter's gospel that was just simply organized by Mark. When the gospel was first written, like the other gospels, there was no name at the top like there is at our Bible today, but it was understood in all the ancient manuscripts that Mark was the one who had compiled these writings. So that's the Gospel of Mark. Hope it's helpful. Talk to you guys soon.